Go tell it on the mountain, over the hill, and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain. Let my people go. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hill, and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain. Let my people go. Final name etched in stone on the Civil Rights Memorial is Martin Luther King Jr., April 4th, 1968, Memphis, Tennessee. A city on the banks of the Mississippi River, a waterway that in many ways divides our nation in half. Dr. King had been invited by a longtime friend and advocate of nonviolence, James Lawson, who had worked with and trained the students in Nashville, had been fired from his job and then took one in Memphis. He'd been invited by James Lawson to support the sanitation workers' strike, of which Lawson was the chairman. The mayor of Memphis had previously headed the sanitation division, and he continued to oversee inhumane and inhuman working conditions, inspiring the slogan for the strikers, "I am a man." At the same time, Dr. King was preparing for what he named the Poor People's Campaign, scheduled for Washington, D.C. in June, expanding the struggle for equality to everyone. And on March 28th, Dr. King led a protest in Memphis that unexpectedly turned violent, so he returned on April 3rd to help lift the spirits of the strikers and their supporters, and he stayed that night where he often did when he came to Memphis, room 306 of the Lorraine Motel, an establishment frequented through the 60s by black musicians recording at Stax Records. The hotel's a mile and a half from the Mason Temple, where he spoke to a crowd that filled the place that stormy night. "I don't know what will happen to me now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it doesn't matter to me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I would like to live a long life. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to go to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." The next afternoon, some say after a pillow fight with some of his staff, Dr. King went out on the balcony, where he leaned over the railing and spoke to Ben Branch, a musician scheduled to play that night at a planned event. "Ben, make sure to play Precious Lord, Take My Hand, and play it real pretty." And then the ugly sound of one shot from a high-powered rifle. On the pilgrimage, we stopped at the old Stax Records recording studio. It's now a museum of the soul sounds of the 50s and the 60s. We visited the Mason Temple, taking turns standing at the podium where Dr. King made his final speech. We formed a circle in front of the podium and we sang, "Go tell it on the mountain," and lift every voice and sing. And then back on the bus for the short ride to the Lorraine Motel. It's also now a museum. And you can visit the room where Dr. King was staying. It looks the same. No one's allowed on the balcony. It's a time and a place of reflection, not just standing in the parking lot, many of us alone with our thoughts. Before gathering and singing quietly now, "Precious Lord, take my hand and we shall overcome." A few hours later, after King was shot, Robert Kennedy on a campaign swing in Indiana, despite fear for his safety, spoke to a mostly black audience in Indianapolis. They had not yet heard the news. I have bad news, he began. For all our citizens and the people who love peace all over the world. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed by a white man. Kennedy's aides had never heard him speak publicly before of his brother's death. Kennedy went on to implore the country to make an effort to go beyond these difficult times. My favorite poet, he continued, is Aeschylus, who wrote, "In our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will comes wisdom, through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need is not hatred, is not violence or lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whoever they might be. Let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. His impromptu speech, considered among the great speeches of American history, is credited in part with preventing rioting in Indianapolis, a night when cities burned across the country. 2 months later, the hearse carrying Robert Kennedy's body stopped near the Lincoln Monument, where 5 years earlier, Dr. King had shared his dream with the world. And on this dark evening was now the backdrop for an encampment of Resurrection City, populated by those taking part in the Poor People's March on Washington. The citizens of that temporary town sang the battle hymn of the Republic before the hearse began to move, continuing across the river to what was once home to Robert E. Lee and is now home to so many American heroes, Arlington Cemetery. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make us holy, did they die to make us free.